Thank you very much. Good morning. The title of our session is Challenges in Implementation of the Business Responsibility to Respect Human Rights. So in this room, we're very much focused on the corporate perspective. We have an excellent set of speakers lined up for you today. And in a moment, we will hear from 4 business speakers, each of which has been paired with a respondent to keep the conversation nice and dynamic for all of you. In addition, we have working group member Margaret Young, who will intervene from time to time when she would like to. There will also be time for questions and answers at the end. We're running quite a tight schedule, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end. You know by now how it works. There's a speakers list in the corner, which will be open during the presentations. It will close when the last speaker has spoken. And given that we have a tight schedule and we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible, please do keep your interventions to no longer than 2 minutes. So just a quick word about the context for this session before we get started. Each company speaker has been asked to look at an aspect of the corporate responsibility to respect in practice, a particular piece that they're looking at within their business, whether in relation to human rights policy commitment, human rights due diligence, or remedies. In addition, we've asked them to focus in on a particular challenge or challenges they may be facing within the company. What are some of the internal or indeed external barriers they may have faced when making the corporate responsibility to respect real? So this whole session recognizes that now, today, we're very much in the age of how. You know, sort of 5 to 10 years ago, the question was what in relation to business and human rights? And now, of course, we have the guiding principles. It was also why in relation to business and human rights. And it seems there's a pretty strong business case out there now. So this is all about the how, the rules of the road, as Mike Posner said yesterday. So very much about getting concrete and granular in practice. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Keiichi Ushijima. I will ask politely all speakers to stick to the allocated time. I have a hammer here, and I'm not afraid to use it. So Keiichi, if you could begin by telling us about your experience in Hitachi in relation to building a human rights policy, but also how you're talking about human rights within the business and the reactions that has provoked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Keiichi Ushijima from Hitachi Limited. It's an honor to be here today. So I try to manage my slot. Briefly, briefly, I will explain about our company, and next, why Hitachi starts human rights activity, and third, explain about Japanese context that is different from global standards, and how we promoting human rights activities and challenges. So Hitachi was established over 100 years ago as a repair shop for a mining company. Then it grew as the Japanese economy grew. Presently, we are conducting business in numerous industries. In short, Hitachi is the quintessential modern global company with over 900 group companies operating in 55 countries. Regarding human rights, we launched our human rights project in Europe in 2008 because we realized human rights issues were one of our weaknesses with the CSR program at the time. Europe was selected since it was the most advanced region in human rights. This is why we organized our European CSR team to promote human rights for Hitachi on a global scale. So, in Japan, if we say human rights issue, it usually means discrimination. That's because of a historical reason. Over 600 years ago, Japan had a social hierarchy like a caste system. Today, some social regions remain discriminatory, even though the social hierarchy has disappeared. Therefore, some companies, including Hitachi, used to be involved in the discrimination of employment. Still, many Japanese companies are required to participate in training hosted by Japanese NGOs, focusing on Japanese historical discrimination every month, which seems to be a brainwashing or punishment, to be frank. This is the reason why Japanese education on human rights focuses on discrimination issues. Moreover, we pronounce jinken about human rights in Japanese, combining two Chinese characters. Ken originally comes from kenri, that means rights. However, it's shortened and the pronunciation of ri has gone. As a result, lots of Japanese people don't understand human rights as rights, but more as a consideration or kindness. Essentially, it comes from reasons of historical context and the translation of language. I think we should understand these two elements are likely to obstacle to accurate understanding. Then, how we are promoting human rights activities. As I mentioned, our European CSR team leads Hitachi's human rights initiative globally. I'll give you an embarrassing situation as an example. A couple of years ago, we had a meeting between the European CSR team and our Japanese human rights team. After a presentation from Japanese team, our European team was shocked. They couldn't understand how it calculate how it of human rights, how correlated human rights. Because the Japanese team explained we should use the glass meeting room when we meet a lady at the office as an example of human rights. That is okay in terms of consideration or avoiding sexual harassment, but it's simply not relevant to a context of human rights issues. It was then I felt a huge gap in understanding of human rights between Japan and the rest of the world. Consequently, we would need to incorporate global standards and apply it across all group companies. When Professor John Ruggie team launched the SHIFT project, we built a partnership with them to incorporate the UN guiding principles into our management paradigm. Last summer, we held an internal 2-day workshop in Japan facilitated by SHIFT team to learn UN guiding principles and the due diligence process. So we invited corporate departments relevant to our value chain, such as R&D, procurement, marketing, human resources, etc., from group companies like Hitachi Metal, Hitachi Chemical, Hitachi Construction Machinery, and so on. Moreover, the CSR global team was comprised of local leaders from Europe, America, Australia, India, China. Actually, 40 participants of 55 were Japanese. However, we discussed everything in English from the beginning to the end in order to avoid mistranslation and clearly understand the definition of human rights in English. I intentionally created the situation that participants could recognize differences in the global perspective. The initial feedback from Japanese participants was complete culture shock. It was a sign the workshop was successful. The key points that we learned through the workshop are to respect not only internal but also external people's human rights, and to identify not only business brand awareness, but also human rights risks. The participants could understand differences of countries and the linkage with our business. A manager of HR team now, who is in charge of human rights training program, says that I want to share my experience through the workshop with the other employees. So people's mindset seems to have changed through the workshop. Overall, it was excellent workshop thanks to Shift team. A month later from the workshop, our Chinese CSR leader held the workshop on UN guiding principles in China. I think this was very unique. It was designed for Chinese. The presentation and discussion was done in Chinese. When our Chinese CSR leader explained the plan of the workshop at our annual CSR Global meeting, interesting. Japanese general manager said that human rights are very sensitive issues, and it might be better to change the theme of the workshop. However, our Chinese CSR leader said that even in China, human rights is important. So now our company educates UN guiding principles in China. That also very much symbolic case demonstrating the company becoming a global company. Our further challenge is simple. How we can apply single policy, framework of due diligence process and training program to the complex Hitachi group. So as I mentioned, Hitachi has over 900 group companies operating in various countries via different diversified business units, such as ICT, power, transportation, and materials. Okay, it's not easy to focus a specific issue and to apply high standards beyond local and industry's context. Presently, we are formulating a cogent human rights policy as a supplement to our codes of conduct that will be released by the end of this fiscal year. So our European CSR team is now drafting in cooperation with our Shift team and other region CSR leaders. The further challenge for the next year is establish a due diligence process to be applied to all group companies. So then we are planning to have a feasibility study in some business units and the regions and share the other regions. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. I've asked Gitanjali to come in briefly as a respondent to what she's heard, and this is the format we will be following for the whole of this panel. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gitanjali Mukherjee from Singapore Management University. Thank you, Keiichi-san, for that illuminating presentation on Hitachi's approach to business and human rights. I would also briefly like to thank GBI for the privilege to share this panel with such distinguished experts. I'd firstly like to commend Hitachi on undertaking the creation of a company-wide human rights policy, as well as engaging so proactively with the guiding principles, a step that certainly seems somewhat unique in the Japanese context. I really appreciated Keiichi-san's honest appraisal of the understanding gap in conceptualizing the intent of the GPs and the process undertaken by Hitachi to train and create awareness amongst its employees. The immediate impact on the employees through the training is really a sign of the need for such training in organizational cultures where human rights in the context of business is not sufficiently understood. I feel that this conceptual gap is something that is faced in ASEAN as well. I'm currently involved in a 10-country study looking into the existing laws and frameworks in ASEAN on Pillar 1 of the framework, that is the state duty to protect. I was asked to speak today, therefore, on how states can support and even trigger business implementation of the GPs, reflecting on my experience of the ASEAN context. In our research, we found that while CSR is regulated in many ASEAN states, there is very little direct guidance to businesses from states on human rights. This is also reflected in the proliferation of CSR initiatives by businesses in the region, contrasted against the paucity of businesses attempting to engage creatively with the GPs in the manner that Hitachi has done. One primary area that is regulated by some states in ASEAN is reporting requirements and corporate governance guidelines. Malaysia's stock exchange regulator, Bursa Malaysia, requires all public listed companies to disclose corporate social responsibility activities undertaken by them and their subsidiaries, and if there are none, to provide a statement to that effect. This is a mandatory obligation. In Singapore, the stock exchange regulator issued voluntary reporting guidelines encouraging companies to assess and disclose the environmental and social aspects of their organizational performance. This was issued in June 2011. As has been stated in other panels, due diligence requirements is therefore one approach through which states can trigger engagement with aspects of human rights. I would be further interested to know whether Japan has any such due diligence requirements for companies and what impact it may have had. Additionally, whilst in some states like Indonesia, CSR includes obligations towards labor and anti-corruption, while in many other states, the concept of CSR is simply limited to philanthropy. As Mr. Keiichi mentioned, there seems to be a dissonance in understanding precisely what human rights in business entails and how this differs from and is complemented by CSR. This is clearly an area where education and training on the guiding principles is needed. As the session is looking at implementation challenges, I would like to bring up a few points for reflection here. Some of the pressing business and human rights issues faced in many countries in ASEAN are the challenges of labor trafficking, use of forced labor, and difficult working conditions, as well as the need to reconcile development of resources for economic growth with the violations of the rights of populations indigenous to the area. These are complex issues that require joint solutions from business, government, and civil society. This, perhaps, is the biggest difference between the experience of Hitachi and the challenges in Southeast Asia, that for the guiding principles to be embedded in ASEAN, more integrated approaches between states and businesses need to be undertaken to implement the responsibility of business to respect human rights. Thank you. Over to you, Catherine.
Oops. Thank you, Gitanjali. That's great. Okay, so our next pairing of sparring partners is Ron Popper from, don't be scared, it's okay. Ron Popper from ABB and Jim Baker from the Council of Global Unions. Ron, I'd like you to begin to move us from sort of policy commitments into this area of human rights due diligence. What's that beginning to look like within ABB, and what are some of the challenges that you may have faced yourself as you bring this agenda forward in your company?
Thank you, Catherine. I hope you can hear me clearly at the back. Before this session, Catherine asked me to illustrate due diligence practices for better and for worse in ABB through a couple of stories rather than the dry stuff. And I will do that, but before I go on to my storytelling, I'd just like to remind myself and everybody else that of something very, very simple, that within companies you're dealing with human beings. You may have all the rules and processes and command and control processes in place, but you're dealing with human beings who may or may not like to follow rules. They may be individuals, les individualistes, etc. So we, as we sit here in our Geneva bubble and say the way things should be, let us please remember that companies are populated by individuals who have their own particular view of the world and of rules. Having said that, I'd like to tell you a couple of stories to illustrate how we have been embedding human rights due diligence in our business and the challenges that we've faced. One is a sort of amusing stroke tragic story, and the other one is more of a success story. We started on the corporate responsibility to respect road in the mid-2000s, and by 2007 we had our first building block, which was a human rights policy in place. It was then obvious that we needed to embed human rights thinking and processes in the business decision-making processes. And my first story relates to how I went along to a key committee called the Project Risk Review Committee back in 2007 to try and get a human rights checklist embedded in their review of upcoming projects. And it's a very thorough review. And I was a little nervous, a little wet behind the ears as I went in, because they were notoriously tough. I got in there ready to do my sales pitch. And before I even sat down, the head of the committee, who was notoriously tough, said, Ron, you've come to tell us about human rights. My wife is interested in human rights. She's a member of Amnesty International. Maybe you should go and talk to her. From that somewhat unpromising start, I did get to sit down and did manage to sell the idea of the checklist, and it has subsequently been embedded. But the sequel to this story, and the learning from the story perhaps, is that 2 years later, that head of that committee had moved to another job, and he gave me a panicked telephone call from Chennai in India saying, Ron, I think I've got a human rights issue. You know, and I resisted the temptation, although it was tempting to get him to call his wife instead. And I gave him some advice, as I'm supposed to do. But it shows that people change. It is possible to move mountains, and that checklist has now been embedded. But it's always, the question always arises, how effective are such due diligence processes, and how are people held to account if they do or do not follow them? I think in this respect, in this particular context, we have a mixed picture. I think some sales staff are still into box-ticking exercises. Some people, despite our awareness-raising campaigns and courses, are still unaware of what human rights risks are until you get a panicked telephone call. And of course, there's a lack of consistency. I know the GPs refer to the need for consistency across different agencies of government. The same applies to business, and in a large and very decentralized company, it's extremely difficult to get that degree of consistency, or the same degree as we would wish to have across government. So it's just a couple of sobering conclusions there about the challenges that we face. Now the happier story. It's designed to show that if you bang your head against a door long enough, you can break the wood, you can get through. And more particularly, if the business case is clear to the people that you are trying to persuade, you will have that door open for you very quickly, and maybe a little red carpet rolled out for you. The story is the following. We were trying to embed human rights due diligence into our mergers and acquisitions process. This morning I heard about the need to embed human rights during or post-acquisition. We were talking about pre-acquisition, and ABB is a company that has targeted or looked at a number of companies in the last few years. But we didn't have any kind of checklist, any kind of work within the M&A process. So after a year of what I would call full and frank discussions with our M&A team, we got there. They finally understood that, yes, sustainability was a part of what they needed to look at, and they didn't want any kind of environmental, social, or human rights baggage coming with them when we acquired a company. So the way it works is that we now have a sustainability work stream within mergers and acquisition, led by one person who's a very switched-on person who, when she sees that there's a particular issue coming up in a potential acquisition, she turns to the experts within the company and she turns to the human rights group quite frequently. And she apportions the work to the specialists. So the story is we were targeting a company in Europe last year, and that had customers worldwide. We did a strong degree of due diligence, desktop, on-site, data room due diligence on this company. But given the nature of the business, and I'm being deliberately coy about telling you where it was and what area of work they're in, we decided to go a little bit further. We had satisfied ourselves that there were reasons for suspicion that their customers might be involved in or might be complicit in human rights abuses. So we hired an external legal company to do additional due diligence on the customers for us. And that was extremely useful, helpful, and revealing. So this is just to show you the way in which human rights due diligence can work, can be embedded in a process, and works reasonably well. Incidentally, we didn't acquire the company, but not for human rights reasons, but for compliance reasons. So in conclusion, it's hard but rewarding work. It does take a lot of time, and I'll just round off by saying what I started off with. Don't forget that it's individuals that are working within companies, and individuals can be brilliant or awful, and they can follow rules or not. So we need to bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. Before I just bring in Jim, there's an awful lot of you standing up, and I feel bad because you might not be able to hear if you don't have the microphone. We'll try our best to project our voices. But if you do want to come and sit at the front on the floor, it's probably totally inappropriate, but it might be more comfortable than standing up, and it could create more of a Woodstock. And there are even some seats, so there's a few seats.
Safety risk, probably.
So feel free to come and join us. Jim.
Thank you. Now, my role is to attack what I've just heard.
Attack in a friendly way.
No.
Do you want the hammer?
No, I think that Ron raised some extremely good issues, and I just want to concentrate on one aspect of it, and one aspect of the guiding principles and of the due diligence process that is difficult, precisely because you are dealing with human beings. I think what's important, and this is regardless of whether you're looking at a major multinational company with operations in much of the world like ABB, or whether it's a small and medium-sized enterprise or whatever it is, it's trying to change the way people think, the sort of instincts, the reactions, what do we look for, etc. And I think a lot of people I deal with, not just on the company side, but on the trade union side as well, are having a bit of a hard time realizing that this is actually quite different than what they've traditionally been doing and what's been called CSR, that it isn't about promoting yourself. It's actually trying to determine where you may be endangering people's human rights, which is an entirely different mentality, and it's a different focus. And interestingly enough, often when you go through this process, people actually get quite interested and even excited, because it's something that deals with what they do every day. It's not something that's what's ironic. You know, in reality, it's much less abstract and much more practical than it may seem at first glance, because you're actually dealing with what am I doing and what's the impact of what I'm doing, and the people I work with, what are they doing and what's the impact, and that can be a simple or complicated process, but the important thing is to change the way people think. The area where I think it's been difficult in a lot of the CSR approaches, which the guiding principles should facilitate, is the sort of ugly stepsister of rights has been freedom of association and collective bargaining in many companies. That's the area where they don't like to deal with it, or they define it in various ways. One of my favorite definitions of freedom of association comes from a country where a lot of people have the same accent as I do, and is, how could they possibly have freedom of association if we don't explain to them why they shouldn't have a union? Well, I don't think too many people would really accept that, but in fact, I've heard several companies make that argument. Oh, well, if we don't, and we can't do it ourselves, if we don't hire a consultant to explain why they shouldn't have a union, how are they going to really be able to make up their mind freely? Because the workers won't argue against it, so they have to hear the two sides of the story. Now, that's absolute nonsense. Now, one of the reasons it's nonsense is exactly what Ron started and ended with, which is that you're dealing with human beings. And if you're dealing with human beings in a way that creates fear, you're in fact attacking a human right. And that's true even inside a company. If people have to be persuaded, you may have the command line and say, do this, but if people don't understand why, they won't do it correctly, because they'll create situations in which people do not in fact have the liberty, if you will, to be creative and find solutions. So I just want to emphasize it's a thought process, and it's something where you have to think about the human consequences. The other aspect that I think is quite interesting about the due diligence process is that it's because of the way business has reorganized in a fairly radical way, the way work is being performed, it's much more difficult than it would have been in the old days when it was companies and subsidiaries and you didn't have all these huge numbers of business partners and the rest. But that also requires looking at the human situation and looking at what it is, and it requires putting in not just systems, but also a certain sensitivity, constant sensitivity as to what's happening and what's developing. And I'm hoping that the human rights respect will, I don't much like the business case. That's something where maybe I can disagree a bit, but only simply that it doesn't seem to me like we ought to be in a world where you sort of have to make a business case, because if there's a business case for not respecting human rights, which there is sometimes, I would hate to see that prevail. And so I think that's a road we have to be careful on. But having said that, I think there is one key element of human rights which is important on freedom of association and collective bargaining, which is the workers themselves need to be able to determine what they want. They need to have their own voice. And taking care of people is not a human right. People being able to take care of themselves is a human right. And that's a quite important distinction. So the business saying we're doing all kinds of good things for our workers, therefore respecting human rights, is not in fact the key. And when you do respect human rights, of course, and you do have a possibility for workers to have their own organizations and defend their own interests, you don't have to go in with 100 pages of checklists. You know they're defending it. You know they're taking care of their rights every day, regardless of whether people come in on an airplane once every 5 months or not. And so those kinds of human rights processes can also improve a company, improve a work environment, and that sort of indirect business case I kind of like, but not in the traditional CSR sense. So unfortunately, I have to agree with virtually everything Ron has said, and I think that it's a sign of a company, and not enough yet, that are taking these things quite seriously.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim and Ron. That's great. And thank you, actually, both of you, for touching on the issue of culture change within companies, which I think is an important piece of this debate that doesn't often get raised. If anyone would like to be asking a question at the end of the speakers' presentations, you have to sign up on the speakers list. I know we all hate doing this, but it's UN protocol. And so I've been asked to remind you to do that. So moving on, we've got Tony Kuo from Flextronics, who will be speaking, followed by Viviane Chiavi from the International Chamber of Commerce. And Tony, I've asked you to keep us in this area of human rights due diligence, but turn the lens a little bit and talk about the issue from the perspective of a supplier to many global brands out there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. And it's an honor to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm also mindful of the time because I'm sitting next to Catherine's hammer here. So firstly, let me introduce you to Flextronics in case you're not familiar who we are. Flextronics is one of the world's largest electronics manufacturing services company, or what we refer to as contract manufacturer. So we are the outsourcing partner or manufacturing partner for a lot of the electronic brands. So many of the electronic products you use on a daily basis most likely manufactured in one of our facilities, except for Apple products. We don't make Apple products. Just make that point clear. So we employ about 200,000 employees globally. We are located in about 30 countries in about 4 continents. And I say 200,000 employees, 50% of that are located in China. So we have quite a big presence in China. And as you've heard from some of the panelists here, and it's human rights issues. It's something that we're looking at very closely in our Chinese operations. And I'll talk about. I too have two stories I'd like to share. And one would be a success story that we have in China, and the other would be a success story that we have in Brazil. And so before I go into storytelling, I just want to talk about our human rights journey. We started on this journey about 5 years ago. So my role in the company is to help the company put in place policies and standards and a management system. And today, I'm glad to say that we have quite a comprehensive management system in place that includes a due diligence process. But I'm not going to stay here and say that we have a perfect system, because we're still continually it's an evolving process. We are continually learning from what's happening in our operations, and we're continuing to fine-tune our management system. And so we go through a 6-step process in terms of the implementation of our management system. And so we start off with capacity building. I mean, we build awareness. We conduct a lot of training. As we have 200,000 employees, so it's a lot of training to be done. And it's a huge challenge in our organization, because there's a high turnover rate of employees as well, and capacity building is something that we do on a continuous basis. And then we have our when we do the due diligence and assessment process to understand what our risks and impacts are. And then we have we put in place improvement plans or remediation plans to look at mitigating these risks and improving on the gaps that we have identified. All right, and so it's a long process. We're still in the early part of our journey, and but we're beginning to see successes in the things that we do. All right, so. There are also, I talk about some of the challenges. I talk about challenges in capacity building, but we are in an industry where it's very audit driven. All right, so some of our operations, like our bigger operations, receive about, in average, about 3 to 4 audits a month. Right, so sometimes audits take our focus away from the implementation process and the improvement process. And we hope that, a lot of times the audit results mirror that of the risks that we already identified. So, they're not telling us anything new. So we really hope that our business partners and our customers would come sit down with us and join us in developing the improvement plans for us to move forward in this area. So enough about the challenges and complaints, but I'd like to share a couple of stories or success stories. First of all, would be our largest facility in China, which is in South China in Zhuhai. So if you're familiar, Zhuhai is right across from the border from Hong Kong, and that's a facility that we employ 60,000 employees. And it's what we call a campus. And so every year, if you're not familiar with China, a majority of our employees in our operations in China are what we consider as migrant workers. I mean, they are workers who come from rural areas of China to work in the coastal areas. And every year, especially during Chinese New Year period, these migrant workers would go back to their villages, and in the past we constantly have a problem of a returnee rate. I mean, the workers would go back and will never come back, right? And our returnee rate in the past used to be about 50%, but we're glad to say that in the past 2 years, last year our returnee rate was about 98%. Workers returning to come back to work with our operations in Zhuhai. And this year, I've got 2 minutes. I gotta be fast. This year, our returnee rate is at 99.8%. So we almost got 100% returnee rate. And we've actually talked to the employees, and they said that they attribute that to the work that we've done in our CSR work that we've done, and the fact that we've invested a lot of money in improving the working and living conditions at our facility in China. So do I have time to tell the Brazil story?
Yeah, do it quickly.
Okay, quickly. And the other story I want to tell is about we have a facility in Manaus in Brazil. When Flextronics took over the facility, we bought over the plant. The plant was not making money. Morale was very low. General manager was instructed by management to say, you go in and your job is to look at whether it can be salvaged or not close the factory, right? And very close to closing the factory, but the manager basically managed to turn the factory around by coming up with a social contract with the employees. What we found was a majority of the employees in the factory had very little education, right? Not a lot. Most of them did not even go past elementary school education. So he told the employees that, look, if you help me turn the factory around, right, I'll make sure that each and every one of you get a proper education. So glad to say that the factory is now making money. It's very successful. All the employees are still around. Absenteeism in the factory is non-existent. 100% of the employees have now gotten their high school education through support from Flextronics, and about 30% of those have actually gone to college and gotten their degrees. So that's a tremendous story, and we always use Flextronics Manaus as one of the model, right, for CSR for our global operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Vivienne, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd like to thank you as well as the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights for inviting me to speak today, and I'm honored to be on this panel. I just want to say I may not be sparring with Tony because actually we're on the same page on a lot of things, and actually my organization, the International Chamber of Commerce, represents business worldwide, so we may be more on the same page, but we'll see. Yeah, I can't move it. It's stuck on the table, so I'll try to. Okay. ICC is the World Business Organization, and we represent companies, businesses, enterprises from all sectors of the world. That's our biggest strength. We're truly global and representative. Our main aim at ICC is to promote an open trade and investment system throughout the world, and our conviction is that trade is a powerful force for peace and prosperity. We have 3 activities: policy advocacy, dispute resolution, and rule setting. In dispute resolution, ICC's International Court of Arbitration is the world's leading court of arbitration. In policy advocacy, ICC's member companies develop recommendations in a range of areas from corporate responsibility and anti-corruption, trade and investment, environment, IP, and other areas. ICC's Commission on Corporate Responsibility and Anti-Corruption has developed a wide range of business ethic tools in a number of areas. ICC's rules on combating corruption were the first global business rules in the area, issued in '77 in conjunction with the FCPA. We have a guide on supply chain responsibility, guidelines on third parties, whistleblowing guidelines, and other business ethics tools. We've been active since the beginning of John Ruggie's mandate in developing and contributing to the development of the guiding principles. And throughout that process, we affirm business's firm commitment to assuming its corporate responsibility to respect human rights. We consistently conveyed the need for a balanced approach and that the state duty to protect human rights is fundamental for business to be able to assume its responsibility in the area. The strength of Ruggie's framework, in our view, is that it's practical, risk-based, and flexible. We welcome the interpretive guide for business that Professor Ruggie developed with the UN. It's very important. It's on the UN website. It was issued in the fall 2011, and we recommend that this guide be used as the authoritative interpretation of the guiding principles for business. In terms of the survey, some of you may have been at the panel yesterday on the launch of the results of a survey that was done to assess businesses' views on their own implementation of the guiding principles. ICC cooperated with the UN Working Group in sending the survey along with GBI and the International Organization of Employers to its member companies. And we were glad to help make that survey sampling truly representative. It may be not surprising that what our companies are telling us in terms of the implementation of the guiding principles is very much in line with the survey results. The companies are unsure as to how far to go into their supply chains to assess impacts, challenged to get credible information from business partners. It's difficult to manage situations where leverage over partners is limited. It's difficult also to operate in situations where human rights protection is not part of the national law or it's not fully applied. It's often challenging for companies to translate policy commitments into relevant operational procedures. A couple of points that I'd like to make more specifically: one needs to make a distinction between what you can control as a business and what you contribute to in terms of adverse impacts and what you cannot control. In ICC's view, a company is responsible for the impacts or those it contributes to. The mere existence of a contractual relationship does not mean of itself, I'll try to hurry up, that responsibility is shifted to another party. In other words, a contractual relationship of itself does not of itself constitute an impact. I only have 1 minute, so I'm going to rush. I'd like to make another point. As we heard in the panel chaired by Professor Kaufman yesterday, it's very time consuming for companies to align the systems across the different departments to address human rights impacts. One needs to already assess what due diligence processes are already there and integrate the different processes. Another point, and I'm going to close here, Catherine, and it seems obvious, but it needs to be said, companies need a conducive environment. Governments need to establish a conducive environment for companies to be able to implement their responsibility. And the ability of an enterprise to respect human rights is directly affected by that. It's very difficult for businesses to do that in an environment where corruption can be endemic and where they may be faced with a systemic failure of compliance with the rule of law. Those are my main points for now. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Viviane, and thank you actually for bringing up the state duty to protect as well, because it's very relevant. Obviously, in this room we're talking about businesses, but next door there's a session on states, there's one on the UN, and one on civil society, as you know. And this is very much a shared responsibility and a shared agenda. So I'm really pleased that you put that back on the table. I hope that you're all thinking of questions to ask as well, because I'll feel terrible if I've rushed all the speakers and there are no questions at the end.